so.
I'm not sure which one this one is.
Let's see where we are.
I think it's 15, Chris. I think. Listen to this. I just marked this. Who would have thought the day would come when boys could meander into the private sanctuary of girls' toilets, when sickly soiled junior high boys could ogle girls' bodies in the shower? Now, what?
Chris is Donovan in shock and having to be back at work.
He took it in stride. He came in Tuesday for a couple of hours and he may have worked off campus, you know, a little bit too. I don't know about that. But then yesterday he was here the majority of the day and, you know, it's so hard to come back from a 1 or a 2 week vacation.
I can't imagine what it's like after 3 months.
Yeah, and so to come back the few days right before kickoff, you know, he's hitting the ground running, but he was smiling and laughing and,
Okay.
you know, so we had a all staff potluck and celebrated him coming back
Good.
and some birthdays. So I think he's gonna be good, so.
Good. Well, I-
Chris, he is the best preacher we've ever had, in my view.
Do you think so? And why do you? Is it
He's
because,
a terrific preacher.
yeah,
He's got a great sense of humor.
yes,
He's just great guy.
yeah. He's
Really,
very good at the storytelling,
oh,
Yeah.
and then he knows the theology.
he really knows how. He knows how.
Are you driving yet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Miss Daisy is driving herself.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good.
I miss Susie Lane.
I'm John Thorpe, Susie. How are you?
Find out about.
Did you write your check?
When you go, yeah, I accept for it. Oh, I already know, I think I can discuss it. Oh, did that? This goes away next week. Right. Yes. And, appointment this afternoon is great.
Well, good luck with your chapter, John.
Chris, thank you, dear. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, I had mine this morning.
Yeah. But they were all the issue.
Absolutely. If I could just sort of unhitch it here and throw it in the bag, not have to worry about it from the bottom, because it's higher.
Yeah. How long are you supposed to do it?
50 minutes.
Oh,
Yeah, 45.
Yeah.
Because I get 10 lovely minutes of ice at the end of it. So-
You know, when you're not having surgery or injury, that's torture, but after surgery, that life, I have never been so much pain. Never. And but after the surgery, man,
It feels good.
it is, I wonder several times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I've still got my ice machine at home, but it's still, you'll chuckle, fill it up for me and strap it on.
Just, I haven't used it, I'm saying. And I'm.
Which are great because they're adjustable.
Yes, frozen peas.
Yeah, very good. And so, Bill is back to teaching as of yesterday, because we've got pictures of our great nephews who are in grades 10 and 11. They're going back to school yesterday. Is he that on?
I think all planned.
So he only teaches seniors?
He teaches, But, they can computer science.
Okay,
And so
that was
so
being really overseen.
most of that.
So
But okay.
we have our other great nephew who's there, who is a senior this year, Charlie. I don't know, I have no idea whether he's in any of those classes or not.
That's one.
Melinda's grandson.
Oh,
Grandson. But it's Will Cole, her son.
yes.
Their children are, Charlie and Annabelle.
And I don't know whether he taught, Will.
Oh, I wonder, and I mean, it seems like he might have.
Yeah. And I don't know. Okay. Yeah, this is Roger, I have Roger Jones, Mary Evelyn.
Oh,
He had surgery.
oh, he did.
Wednesday.
Okay.
No, it's
Yesterday, because I saw her at church from a distance on Sunday, but didn't talk to her, so I didn't know it was. But it was oh gosh.
And it's supposed to
This
be
is down in Atlanta, or did he have?
Yeah, he had Atlanta.
Yeah.
And apparently they're gonna come home tomorrow.
Whoa. Home to Nashville tomorrow?
Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Now, see, they may have, they went into the groin.
Sure,
They may have a doctor here in
Yeah.
Nashville that
Yeah.
that
I hope
they
so.
work with.
yeah, I would hope so,
It's a
because they
study.
still, yes, somebody here can monitor, because they still gotta monitor that, insertion site,
Now, that could change.
of course. Of
Gosh,
course.
they do things so much faster.
Oh, man, it's amazing.
Wow. How long do you stay in the hospital for that?
Oh,
Overnight?
not always, not even always overnight.
Well, of course, they don't.
Oh, what, yes, there's no diagonal right both quadrant incision anymore, no. Unless things are bad. You have one of those?
No.
Okay.
And I used to say, and the first one was an emergency, we want the biggest total cost of the Griffith. Because it's and cold.
And when, if she had continued to come vaginally, was that Emily? Is she your oldest? Okay.
Yeah. And so and now on Friday, she was right on the correct decision, I was 9 months pregnant. Monday, I went to the hospital for the
Right.
and presto tango.
She decided to stand up
Yeah,
and stand on her cord and walk out.
right. Exactly.
Did that set you up for what her personality was gonna be like for the
I
rest of
didn't
the
think about it that way, but I shouldn't have.
This gonna be a strong woman.
Yeah. And I remember that I felt her move, but I didn't realize that she was moving that.
It was I mean, to completely go from head down to feet down, there's not much space in there to do that. Yeah, I knew that. Can I feel that from you? I'd love
Can I go get your copy and I'll catch you on this too?
Just the one card today, just brought.
Yeah, just because that one. Yeah, and that with home transitions,
Okay,
which is the senior, they do more than that, but they do help seniors transition from the home down to.
is it heavy?
Well, she was retired. It's the daughter-in-law, Jana, and the son.
Okay, good one, good.
I love.
Hey, guys.
Yeah, I didn't meet her, she helped with
Good.
mother's second.
And so I was totally just.
Susie, I just. Good.
Thanks. I'm not reading.
In terms of services, yeah, got it.
Oh,
This is
I know.
18-year-old baby, he's right now.
But my friend,
Yeah.
I took Wyatt to school. They used to-
I didn't think, I've not been in your.
Yeah, their older son had taken this truck to me.
That you almost would be that easy there.
So
You are-
And it's less.
And thank God he's 18, but
Unfortunately.
you won't let her.
No.
Oh, no.
Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Well, I thought you were going ahead and.
A bow tie this morning?
Unusually, I have,
No, the one bedroom.
two internments and one internment over the next 3 days.
Oh,
So this afternoon I have
Bedroom, and that's why.
an internment and one for a relative of Casey Tony.
oh my goodness.
And I think,
Who was it? Guy?
yes,
Who is it?
yes. Um, Yes, Betty Smith, I believe her name is, and I think she might have been an aunt.
Okay.
Either an aunt or a cousin. And the way this all came about, I can't remember where she was living. Her daughter called me and said when Casey's father died in '06
And I don't have enough.
and was interned here,
Oh.
Casey suggested that other members of the family, they might want to buy plots here, so I get this call, you know, you may not know a former pastor named Casey told me, and I'm like, yeah, no, I know him, I was here. So, that's today, and then tomorrow, have a internment out at Mount Olivet for, a fellow, he and his wife visited us in December of 19, right before the pandemic. And then, ultimately, because of the pandemic, didn't come, and then he got cancer,
It doesn't have.
so on and so forth. But his father was one of the prosecutors at the
Oh, wow.
interesting family, so she reached out and told me, they had been members of the Alabama, San Francisco. And, we had talked, because I knew the family pastor out there. And then on Saturday, I had an internment here for a guy named Jerry Crutchfield. I think that name.
Yeah, it is.
He was really big in country music business. He has first as a star and then as a producer. He's the father of one of our members. And whenever his grandchildren sang in the youth choir, he was at church and always really pleasant and really a lovely fellow. So, and you know, he died January 22. So,
Wow.
close some of this for family, but that's why I have a bow tie.
That's a busy week.
Sure.
That's a busy week.
Yeah, that's, I've got a fair bit, this week, but. Well, we still have about 5 minutes to go, yeah. So, and how was the visit for the funeral for you?
It was really. So.
Really good,
Is
yeah.
there an identified apartment where you get? So there's not, so that's why,
Yeah.
yeah, so you don't know yet, you can't envision specifically where you're gonna be.
Churches, usually you go, I haven't been thinking we'll have it, that. Briefly, I want.
Yeah.
Stay home.
See if I can
Great.
go in and. look at it.
Emily, welcome back. You look no worse for wear from a beach trip with, small children.
I'm so glad that you got-
Yeah.
you got connected to-
Yeah.
That's true.
Dad was very distant, so I couldn't do it without killing him, so. So I said, there would have been murder.
Yeah.
It would have been.
A murder of crows?
Or a cache of jewels, yeah, it was been a murder of elderly parents by a frustrated daughter. Yeah. It didn't happen.
No. If you're moving and you've got multiple family members helping you,
That's why I had to have professional help.
well, sometimes that can be hard.
9:33, sir.
Yeah.
I think you did.
Are you better
I think
after all
you
the things that have
Really good. I
happened
know.
to you, girl?
Transitions, you know, they went through and identified.
I have to go back to my foot doctor.
Not the key. So,
He walked in and I'm back.
Did you get an email sent out yesterday? You did, okay.
Yes, but then it said it was on Monday.
she's doing better.
No, it was on Tuesday.
On
I
Tuesday?
don't think it was yesterday.
I thought it was yesterday. I thought I wrote it
It
yesterday.
said there would be another one the next day.
I didn't get it, Guy, I did not get an email from you with the group.
Let's see, it was,
Yeah, but
I didn't see it either, so.
it was on this, that was yesterday.
I got it yesterday.
You did get it yesterday, okay,
I did not.
It has blind copies, so I can't see who all it was.
yeah. So it was just a reminder that we're meeting today, gonna get chapter 15 and then not meet next week, but we'll have a meeting on the 31st. And the question is, do we want to bring any goodies?
Well, of course we
9:30
do.
to 11 is either really breakfast or lunch. And
Everything is great.
brunch is not, so maybe some nibbles that would go with coffee and tea.
I can't imagine why we wouldn't.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susie.
So maybe I'll even bring some teapots and make different kinds of tea. That would be a nerdy thing that I would do,
Cause I had plugged in missionary Bible.
because I have plethora of teapots. Let me plan on that.
So isn't it interesting that?
Carolyn and Morgan Harris in the house. I don't see anybody on Zoom today.
I don't either.
They're coming. I thought Carol Ann told me she's not feeling good. And she's gonna be on Zoom, so I thought Kay was too. Maybe they'll come along.
Yes, Rosemary.
While we're thinking about our last meeting and remembering this group and how it's been different, do we want to talk about maybe encouraging some of the men in this group?
Yeah.
To let them know that we do meet on Thursday mornings throughout the year to do lectionary.
To do
stuff.
lectionary Bible study, I think that would be perfectly.
John.
Would we need to change the name?
Absolutely, we would be willing to change the
Okay.
name.
Excuse me a second. Alec?
Y'all come. Y'all come Bible study.
There you go. All one word, y'all come.
Y'all come.
Not that I've heard. Yeah, good to go.
Yeah.
And Crutchfield, we're all good for Saturday?
Thank you, Rosemary, I got it.
Good.
With that COVID around our place again too.
Oh, no, do you really?
Oh, I know it's been around.
They've got COVID around, that like.
It was been over.
So we don't know where.
Yeah, last night I heard of a friend who.
We need to know so that the top.
My sister got COVID. She said.
She had to share all of them.
Yes, okay, thanks. Fine. Are there any cards?
Little card, Roger Jones, Mary Evelyn's husband, he had surgery yesterday. Don't know how it went.
I do, actually. So Mary Ellen Jones's husband had a valve replacement down in Atlanta yesterday. And it went well when I talked to her last night. So they kept him overnight and they do I think an echocardiogram or something today. And assuming that goes okay, they release him. So that's a lot, but the plan is if that happens, they'll spend the night with their daughter in Marietta and then come home tomorrow. So
It's amazing.
it is amazing. Yeah.
Scary.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into this. And if we get through it, you know, y'all can go home early. I've been trying to think all morning where I would start.
Not
Uh,
at the first? I've read it.
pardon me?
Not at the first page.
Not at the first page, well, probably, but.
You asked us, how do we feel about this or that or the other, so I wanna ask you, on page 255. The first full paragraph, the end, covering is threatening to leave their churches if their pastors oppose Trump.
Yeah,
You know, we didn't have that kind of scenario, but as a pastor, how do you deal with that kind of thought?
yeah, interestingly, Susie Lane's old home church with Amy, my wife, over in East Tennessee, First Cumberland Presbyterian Church of Greenville, Tennessee, had a pastor there named Jamie Lively. I don't know if you ever knew Jamie. Followed a much beloved and really wise, fine pastor named Roy Blakeburn. And Amy, who grew up with Roy there, judges all pastors by Roy and finds all of them, including and especially her husband, wanting. Roy set a very high bar for a family pastor, really a wonderful guy. So it was a bit more progressive of a Cumberland church, a little bit higher, more formal worship, great church. And Jamie had been there 25 years and he was probably 55 or something like that, and surprisingly decided to retire early. And part of it was from the pressure of this kind of stuff. And, you know, East Tennessee Republicans are now very different than the kind of East Tennessee Republican back when Amy was growing up in that kind of context. And it was over a nexus of issues. It wasn't just this, but the denomination's position on LGBTQ plus people. I mean, there were a whole nexus, but this kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back. I do know folks who, you know, consider themselves evangelicals, but have, you know, been on the more progressive side of that and have found this to be very true, where they were totally dismissed because they didn't get in line behind Trump. It's problematic. I think the closest I ever came to that personally was the run up to the Iraq War. And when Bush the younger was the president and Cheney was the VP, and the debate whether or not we should go into Iraq was a couple chapters ago. But I think I mentioned in class, it was the first time I can remember where a difference of opinion was seen as unpatriotic, right? You were painted into that corner. And my undergraduate degree was in international relations. I originally thought I was going to go in the foreign service. And this notion for me of stepping out of traditional understanding that, you know, nations don't preemptively engage, and throwing all of that away, most of my elders, you know, could not understand that, could not understand why I was not on board in a, you know, flag waving movement toward that. And I remember having a conversation at a session meeting about that was pretty uncomfortable. And yet I had, you know, enough time and credibility in the congregation that would go back there. But I think here, my experience is a little bit different in that I'm not the head of staff. I'm not the primary preaching pastor. So I think the pressure of this falls more heavily on Donovan than it does on the rest of us on staff. And, you know, I do think one of the challenges in a church like this is we do celebrate being a big tent church, a purple church where, you know, lots of different, but during the Trump time, you know, there was very little middle ground, right? You're either on this side or this side. And that becomes very difficult. And Donovan, who I told you, the heart of his theology comes out of 2 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians, by the way. 2 Corinthians 3-7, really 4, 5, 7, is about reconciliation. And so how do we work together? And you know, when everything is seen only through a political lens and not through a church lens, that can become a challenge. And yet, for those who would say, you know, there are no politics in the Bible, we talked kind of last time about the spirituality of the church. Well, that's really problematic, because it seems to me that the Old Testament prophets and Jesus kind of push us in a different direction. And, you know, I do think that there are folks that I'll hear about, you need to preach the full gospel and all of that kind of stuff, but they're pretty narrowly in parts of the Bible, you know, like Leviticus and Paul. But they generally don't spend a lot of time in the Old Testament prophets that are pushing hard for what does this mean for the least, the last, and the outsider. And so when we talk about the full witness of Scripture, one of the reasons that I've made it my point is to try to teach the whole Bible. Some of you who've been in my classes know that I actually do like Leviticus a lot, but I also like the prophets, and I like Paul, and I like Jesus. I mean, it's the whole thing. It's not just sort of pick and choose. And so this notion that I always talk about of the cross having two dimensions, and how big is your Jesus? My buddy Bill Carter has this great illustration about a time he came home from Haiti. And if any of you've been to Haiti, you've got these folks who are terrific artists who are begging you to buy their pictures. And Bill found this one Haitian guy had done this beautiful cross. It was, Jesus kind of on the cross. And he decides to buy it and bring it home. He tries to take it on the plane. And they're like, hey, wait a second, buddy, your Jesus is too big. And, that's not gonna fit in the overhead, and he used that with the notion, how big is your Jesus? I mean, this is really becoming, how wide is God's mercy? And how are we supposed to, figure that out? To me, I look at what the boundaries are that I try to live my life by, and I think Scripture gives them. But I think being a follower of Jesus means I lift him high and his arms stretch out wide to call whomever he chooses to call. And Lordy, there are going to be some people in that list that I wouldn't have chosen for me. And it's likely that I wouldn't be on somebody else's list, right? So we're talking about justice and grace, and yet where are our boundaries and how do we live by those? So those are some of the thoughts. Good question. Yeah, it occurs to me that this could be a sensitive chapter. What impressed me most, I think, was this notion that Trump or someone like Trump actually was the embodiment of a 50-year movement, that this shouldn't have been a surprise, right? And that frankly, the widespread support should also not have been a surprise, even if it was. And I think about poor Moore and some of the others, just backpedaling. Oh no, they're holding their nose. This is going to change. And the reality is, boy, it's hard for a leopard to change its spots. What you see is kind of what you get. So with that, anything else that jumped out of the chapter for you before we kind of get into it?
I got one sentence in here, guy, that just almost made me vomit. Gender was also a key factor in shoring up support for the unconventional, morally challenged Republican candidate, Donald J. Trump.
Yeah.
Now, boy, that's a little heavy,
Yeah,
mercy.
Yeah.
But she's the one writing the book, so,
yeah.
So
Kip, what
you
were you gonna say?
disagree with that statement, John?
yeah.
Kim, what-
Morally challenged, that's a little strong.
It sounds accurate to me.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. It doesn't to me.
Kit, were you gonna say something?
Along with the first question, in this chapter, I think it brought out how difficult it is for, and it was for many pastors, and still is. She just mentions that, I think it's this chapter, but she mentions it a lot.
Yeah.
She doesn't.
Yeah.
It's tough time.
Yeah. I do think this was interesting where she started about Clinton being a Christian, but the wrong kind. And
And that's the theme. I think Jimmy Carter was the wrong kind of Christian.
Right.
Obama was the wrong kind of Christian. Hillary Clinton's the wrong kind of Christian. It's
Right.
sort of, if your Christianity doesn't look just like this, it's wrong.
yeah, and George Bush, the first, was as well a little bit. So I think you're absolutely right, Emily, yeah.
Okay.
I do think this was interesting on 251. The end of that first paragraph at the top, as the 216 election got underway, it was clear Clinton would not be winning over evangelical detractors. Not that she seemed to be trying all that hard. I mean, I really do think, looking back at that election, there was not as much engagement in the flyover parts of the country. And I really think that that's a national problem. You know, where we're going. On the other hand, you only got a certain amount of time, and you know, is that a fool's errand on the other hand? But yeah. I think a little later in the chapter, it talks about future of the Supreme Court being really, I think, one of the most significant factors of the election.
And you know, Guy, a bunch of Federalist lawyers have written this letter saying that Trump, Article 3 of 14, still not be eligible to run as president again. So now he gave them their court justices. And
Right.
saying that, you know, we're tired of this. kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah. Now we got what we really want. You can shuffle off the more floor.
Yeah, but this may not happen. So we'll see what happens.
This sense that evangelical infatuation wasn't there from the beginning, and started remembering all the people who were in the race, Huckabee, Ben Carson, Rubio, Ted Cruz. I'd forgotten that he was a son of a traveling evangelist.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Guys,
Well, yeah,
when you asked the question, did anything else jump out at you about this chapter? I think about this, what I think, there's lots of takeaways. What really jumps out at me is at where this country was when Trump decided he was going to run. He was able to read the room being the nation.
yeah,
And he took, advantage, I'm not saying he took advantage of that in a negative way, I'm just saying he recognized that. And what I remember, particularly that so upset me during the 2016 leading up to the election, is the way that the media approached him and his candidacy, And that it was, they were approaching it from a very traditional set way that the media up until that time responded to a political candidate. And that was not the game that Donald Trump was playing. That was not the role that he was playing. And so I just really think that he was able to recognize this particular particular point in time and capitalize. And the reality is, he spoke to a lot of people. Now, he didn't speak to me,
Right.
but he spoke to a lot of people for whatever their angst was in their life at that time.
Yeah. I have a book on my desk upstairs. I should have brought it down with me. It's interesting. It looks at a couple of counties in eastern Pennsylvania, including my own. And one that my friend Bill Carter is pastor in, that have been traditionally blue collar, Democratic, and they went completely for Trump at 16. And the thought was, you know, a lot of these are white working class people, and they feel like nobody cares about them anymore. They're dismissed, they're overlooked, and that animus he certainly spoke to, versus a sense of how are we going to get through this together so that all our votes flow. And some of that was race politics, some of that was big city, small town. I mean, a lot of different ways, but tapped into that anger and that sense of disenfranchisement and being dismissed. I think that was part of it, or that you know, other minorities are getting a leg up, and we're feeling we're a minority now, and nobody's caring about us, kind of a deal. And I do think you're right that he was able to tap into that.
At that time, Bobby was traveling for work all over the eastern United States, southeast, mostly in rural areas. I mean, he drove because by the time he flew to a city and drove where he needed to go, it wasn't working. So he was driving all over. And he said everywhere,
Right,
except for the cities, it was all Trump.
right,
So he wasn't surprised at all
right.
that he won, you know, whereas the people in the cities couldn't imagine.
Yeah, I found that too. Last year on sabbatical, I did,
And it's
you know,
still
a
there.
number of these kind of crazy drives. Everyone's like, why are you driving all over the United States on your sabbatical? But I went through, you know, parts of Kansas and, you know, that I'd never been to, and you could certainly see that kind of support.
And we just drove all up through the Northeast, and there was a lot of it still up there too.
I'm sorry, Scott.
Kind of going back to the point that John brought up about morality. I mean, in reality, we don't know a lot about the morality of any political person. We only know what we get to see. We don't get to sit down with them and really hear their heart.
Right.
We hear their talking points. We hear those talking points hashed and rehashed on Fox and MSNBC and everybody. We don't really get to know these political candidates. And I think it's interesting because morality is important. It's very, very important. And yet we really think the president is the one who is going to essentially turn or point the morality for our country. And I think that isn't true. I think we really have to pay attention to that. In recent years, I've been so compelled by people who talked about voting locally. We all turn out for the presidential election, but how important it is to vote locally. Because locally is where you have people who are in the communities that you're going to get to know, who are going to make major decisions about people in your community that you know, and kind of venture out from there. And I think that that's so important to keep in mind. I think also the flip side is there's some reason to, I think, expect that we know to a certain extent the morality of these evangelical leaders that were pushing in this way for a long time. And I think it's fair as brothers and sisters of these people to be able to look back and criticize and also take caution from how easy it is to lose sight of Jesus when you're really pushing hard for a win, even if you started pushing for that win because of something that you found in Jesus.
Right.
And that is a cautionary tale. And I think such an important thing for us to keep in mind.
Yeah.
This book and everything.
Yeah, your point about, you know, we only see a little. I think I mentioned last week, I've recently read a biography of Jerry Ford, and how when the Watergate tapes were released, and people in the country saw the way Nixon was talking about other people, and the scatological language that was part of almost every sentence, it blew people's minds that this was more revelatory of who this person was. And, you know, all of a sudden, people on the Hill thinking, that's not a way to run a railroad. Although it would be interesting how many of them said it would have been fine, except that it was on tape, you know. It's perfectly fine as long as you don't get caught. Now that you're caught, we got to distance ourselves.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do think that's kind of revelatory a little bit. Yeah.
You know, I think that have gotten to the point where we're more interested in their morals and in their personality like that, good and bad, rather than what do they stand for is for the good of the country. Because this is the other is what we hear on the news and the papers and whatever. It's put us into a thought of that's the most important thing. And when it comes down to it, I have found myself not liking any of them.
Right.
But, okay, what does this person stand for, and who do I more align with that way?
Right.
And then I just have to close my eyes and vote.
Right. Yeah, and I think the chapter reflects a certain sense of that as well. And I think what's interesting and what this chapter is wrestling with is the evangelicals for so long with many other candidates were saying, you know, this high standard of what morality should be, and then confronted with a candidate that willfully is talking about stepping away from some of those traditional morals and in fact infringing, kind of giving that person a pass, or saying, well, gosh, all of us, you know, have sinned and fallen short, so let's not worry about this person. And I wanted to kind of press that a little bit I mean, that's surely true.
Yeah.
I mean, I confront that every morning when I shave. But, you know, are there some boundaries? You know, we wrestle in the presbytery if a pastor has stepped over a line of propriety. What level of rehabilitation is there, or does that now deem somebody unfit for leadership in the church?
There's also, with that individual, are they contrite? Or
Right.
is it just who they are?
Right, it's a very, very good point, yeah. How is contrition, how is repentance get fielded out? How does owning one's frailties and what kind of support system is around that person to make sure it doesn't happen again? What about transparency? What about all of those kinds of things come into play? You're absolutely right, Kit, that's helpful. Yeah, please.
What I always have heard from my family who ended up voting for Trump was the end justifies the means. So, you know, and if you think back to that first Trump, Hillary Clinton election,
Hillary Clinton, for whatever reason, had some issues, has some issues, whatever, and just in terms of, there are a lot of people who just plain don't like it, for whatever reason that is, whether it's because she comes across as an assertive or aggressive woman that, or that's how she
Is a woman.
she's being, or is a woman, period. But that, dilemma in terms of, you know, Hillary Clinton or Trump, you know, don't like either one of them, kind of, as you say, close your eyes and vote, but, you know, I have heard in defense of their votes for somebody with the morality or lack thereof of Trump, that, you know, the end justifies the means. They've got their Supreme Court and all that, so.
Yeah,
Guy,
yeah,
I think what I've always had a hard time with around all of this is going back to what you said about Nixon. There were things that he said that nobody knew until they heard the tapes, and then they were appalled.
mhm,
Trump said the things he said out loud,
out loud, right,
and people didn't have a problem with that.
right.
And I've never understood that. And I think the other thing is the rural, contingent and all that that encompasses. What is it about Trump that they identify with if you look at his life
Mhm.
and the way that he has led his entire life? It's the antithesis to the way people who struggle have lived their lives. And that's never made sense to me. It still doesn't.
Well, what I saw was they sat and listened and believed in him. They didn't get on and do their own research into his background. I got on and I found all of his financial and bankruptcies and his.
Yeah,
loans and how
but to
he
me, you don't have to
treated-
do a lot of research to
No,
see.
you don't, but
Yeah.
they believe him. He was,
Yeah.
you hear still, that he's a wonderful businessman. And
Yeah.
they,
Yeah.
and, what a big, what a successful business that he has. It was.
Let's take a look at 253, middle of the page, why Trump? For decades, the religious right had been kindling fear. And then that bottom paragraph, but in truth, evangelical leaders have been perfecting this pitch for nearly 50 years. We're looking for a protector, an aggressive, heroic, manly man, someone who wasn't restrained by political correctness or feminine virtues, someone who would break the rules for the right cause. The ultimate fighting champion for evangelicals. To your point, Lokiel, over on 256, he would protect them. What Trump lacked in eloquence, he made up for in passion. Trump may not be the best Christian, but as a Christian nationalist, he can more than hold his own. And then she uses two illustrations of folks coming on board. Jerry Falwell Jr. And that sad experience with the pool boy. Have to say, you know, when those kind of highlights come out, I generally don't run to the grocery store and get the tabloids I sort of acknowledge it and move on. I don't go looking at the pictures. I just feel so sad that somebody else has fallen. But and then Jeffries and anybody here other than Lokiel, a former Baptist? Who are, okay, a couple. First Baptist Dallas is a big deal. I mean, they had a swimming pool in their campus, bowling, I mean, it was, and this former pastor there, Criswell, I mean, was a kingmaker. So this Jeffress who inherits that mantle is really kind of a big deal. I thought on what is that, 258, the middle paragraph, writing in the Baptist News, Alan Bean later reflected that Jeffress embraced a Jesus-John Wayne dualism. Trump's political ignorance was boundless, but Jeffress wasn't interested in a president who would govern according to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, nor did he think that the Bible had anything to say about governments needing to forgive or turn the other cheek. The role of government was to be a strong man, to protect its citizens against evildoers. Sure, Trump was a notorious womanizer, so was John Wayne. Wayne was an unapologetic racist, being added, and Trump stands proudly in that tradition. Both men represented white manhood in its swaggering glory. Trump was John Wayne's stand-in, his evangelical supporters were looking for. I think that's, telling, and, then this picture on 259, I mean, who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew? Yeah. Yeah. Then we get into some of the evangelicals who are opposed to Trump. Moore, and then this Denny Burke, Michael Gershon, who I've mentioned it here before.
Guy, I'm starting to pay more attention to Russell Moore. You talk about someone who put his neck out
Right,
and it got chopped off.
Right.
That Russell Moore did.
right,
Yeah, he and, he didn't, he's gone on and is finding leadership in other ways.
right. Yeah, and that gets back to the point that Rosemary made earlier, about what happens when you do stand up and, your support turns against you. Do you have the moral courage to stand in the breach and take it and move on? Are you willing to kind of risk it that way, and trust? I do think this over on the bottom of 260 and 261 is interesting. Evangelicals see what's going on, explained a senior advisor to Huckabee. They were looking for someone to be strong and stern, somebody who had an aggressive leadership style. Before long, real evangelical leaders began to fall in line. Dobson, and the Dobsons were, he was a baby Christian. I think that's even in some ways being generous.
Yeah.
And then Grudem, before voting was not the lesser of two, but rather a morally good choice. And then Mike Pence, I hope there is some time in my lifetime a critical biography of Mike Pence that comes out that reveals how hard it was for him, especially in the last few days, so. Yeah. Then we get into this, Eric Metaxas's on 262. And I found this passage, about halfway down the page. How could Bonhoeffer's biographer support a man like Trump? In his own book, after all, he described Hitler's rise to power in words that rang eerily familiar. The German people clamored for order and leadership, but it was as though in a babel of clamoring they had summed up the devil himself, for there now rose from deep wound in the national psyche something strange and terrible and compelling. Metaxas agreed that this Bonhoeffer biography invited some unpleasant parallels with the current situation, but not the ones that might affect. He saw no connection between Trump and Hitler, but he did refer to Trump's opponent as Hillary Clinton.
Hitler.
Hillary Clinton. He suggested too that the critics bore a striking resemblance to the Nazis. It wasn't Trump, but his followers who were guilty of racism and xenophobia. It was the Beltway and Manhattan elites who practiced a new and accepted tribalism and xenophobia against white European Christian varieties. I think that's a really interesting and challenging reading.
And wasn't Trump a Manhattan elite before he,
Exactly, yeah.
however.
Yeah. All
It's
right,
like the imagined victimhood that these people have come to believe because they're told they are victims, that, you know, that there's more discrimination against men than women, there's more discrimination against whites and minorities, you know, and they come to believe these even if it's not based in fact. And then when you feel like you're the victim, you feel like fighting is legitimized.
right.
And I think, I don't know, this whole fear-based religion just feeds into that.
Right, and I think, Emily, what is very interesting to me is we're not talking in so many parts of the country that are being left behind economically, right? Where traditional blue collar, working collar jobs could at one time provide for a family, and those jobs are no longer there. And what do? I taught a book a couple of years ago here called Tightrope. Some of you might remember that, by Nicholas Griffith. And he looked at a number of different lines where, you know, 40 years ago, there were safety nets in health and, you know, even in incarceration. And I mean, all of these. But his suggestion now is that so many parts of the country, folks are walking on a tightrope, and if you fall off, there's nothing there to catch you anymore. And that this was, you know, kind of a willful backing away of social safety net. And, you know, people are not looking at sort of who was responsible for that. And the old notion of, well, you just need to pull your bootstraps up, and so somebody else is getting a better deal than you are, when in fact, so much of the economic structure of the country has changed in 40 years. And what's driving a lot of this sense of, I can't, you know, be the breadwinner in my family anymore, is real economic crisis in the country. But we're not talking about that kind of thing. We're talking about somebody else is getting a better deal than me, rather than how do we transform this?
Right, and I think anxiety about identity is true for everyone.
Yeah.
That I think women these days are, you know, between working and staying home and
Sure.
how do they contribute and all these things, is there's anxiety around those identities, minorities have those, but I think white men are the only people who have anxiety about their identity that then they can use to harm everybody else.
Weaponized to everybody else. I think that's fair. Yeah.
Well, Guy, this week I saw 2 interviews, and I feel like kind of in 2 different ways, kind of applied on where we are. There was one of a Russian, I don't know if he was a Russian agent or a Russian, I don't remember his name, but I can't remember his name. And it was an interview in the 70s or 80s. And he was talking about how what will bring down the United States democracy would be, I think how did he put it, infiltration type of truth, essentially, where, and emotional and intellectual trust of people. And he says it will get to the point where no matter what, people will not believe the truth. Even if it's put right in front of their face, they will not believe the truth. And he says it will take decades to do this, but the work has begun. And that just was like, well, and then another one was of Hillary Clinton. She has a new article about how so many of our population has been isolated. And it's that isolation has hindered their ability to communicate with other people and be only in their own little space. And they don't get, and they only get their news from conspiracy websites and things like that, where they're not getting real news. And they're being told, like, and you hear these people that they're interviewing at Trump rallies and the things they're saying, and they believe it.
Yeah. About halfway down in 263, during the Obama administration, we're talking about a fellow Schlafly now, getting rid of all the manly men. Most women like big, strong John Wayne type men, the kind of men who put out fires, fight in combat, protect the wives and children against intruders, and save damsels in distress. For too long, feminists have made men afraid of men. But it was time for women to say, we love manly men. What do you all think about that? Anybody want to jump into that?
I don't.
No.
You don't like manly men?
Trying to get over it.
Yeah.
And there's a group,
run when I see
you know, I remember, when we celebrated the centennial of the women's right to vote. Was that 2020?
19. 2019.
It was during the pandemic, because we had to meet out front and separate out, ringing the bell.
Ringing the bell.
So anyhow, my point being, 100 years ago, there was a huge majority of women who did not think that they should be paid.
Right.
So, I mean, we're not talking about anything new here.
Yeah.
We're just talking about in a different time. I can remember what I thought about Phyllis Schlafly when I'm in the 70s. But I didn't agree with her, but that was her true self, just like. Just as my true self.
Then we have the whole Hollywood Access tape and that fiasco. And everybody sort of coming along. The notion that what if we all had a hot mic around each one of us all the time? So we're kind of giving them a pass, although some, Russell Moore, John Piper, then the evangelical women, and you want to talk about somebody who lost, empire, Beth Moore. Just really significant. Do any of you know either Jen Hatmaker or Julie Royce?
No, I know of Jen Hatmaker.
I don't know either.
I have friends who think very, very highly of her work.
But on November 8, it became clear that the vast majority of evangelicals have come back around. 81% of white evangelical voters have handed Trump the presidency. Once again, the reports of the death of the religious right have been greatly exaggerated. The moral majority had reasserted itself, electing the least moral candidate in memory of the highest office in the land. And I think to John's point, maybe earlier, we could question that it's, certainly historically looking at John Kennedy's behavior, probably LBJ's behavior. But I think one of the differences is this was sort of known and almost boasted about. I think that to me is one of the distinctions that's different, but, and I would also say, I mean, you know, what's the old line about power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? There's some of that, but this notion that I'm above the law. I could walk down the street and shoot somebody and nobody would care. I mean, I can't,
And he's proven that to be true.
yeah, so,
I think it's also really important. The church, we have got to figure out how to talk about sex more. We do, not the act. Sexuality, we have to figure it out. Because there are white men and all the other colors of men that may be feeling a bit confused about what's acceptable, who may not know what is actually invasive and scary for a woman.
sure.
The Barbie movie, have you seen it? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
It was so good.
Anybody not?
There's this one line in there that hit me so hard in the movie theater. I was so surprised that it hit me so hard. Because I have not befallen anything that is violent toward me or aggressive in any way like that, sexuality wise. But Barbie is walking along in the real world and everybody's relating to her differently. There, she's getting all the whistles and the looks and everybody's staring at her. And Ken is walking along beside her and he's feeling different in the real world too. That's a part of what's happening in the movie. I won't give it away. But he's like, this is great. Sure, it seems to like having me here, you know? And she's like, I don't know, it feels a little aggressive to me. And it was like this gut punch. And I was like, I was just silent and still thinking, I don't think that men know that. Who's telling them? Because it's too scary in the moment to tell them. They may not know. And it wasn't okay for anybody to be telling them for so many years what really is okay and what really feels like you've crossed even the tiniest of lines. And I think they care, but we're not talking about it.
Right.
And I have a 13-year-old boy right now, so I'm like really talking about it. So that's just so you know where I'm coming from.
Over on 266, in the days and weeks that followed, journalists, pundits, and evangelicals struggled to come to terms with the role evangelical Christians had played in the election. And a number of theories emerged. First, well, a whole bunch of them were fake evangelicals, right? Just going to church every now and again. They weren't really with the program. And statistics shows that no, that doesn't work. And then economic motivation. Well, that's not so much as well. I think fears about cultural displacement on the top of 267 far outweighed economic factors when it came to support. More than economic anxieties, middle of the page, it was a threatened loss of status, particularly racial status, that influenced the vote of white evangelicals and whites more generally. I think that is really, really insightful. And I have to say, it was, I think, very telling the other night watching television when the fourth indictment was returned and a large majority of the legal team out of Fulton County were people of color. And Trump and all of his supporters were old white men. And, you know, so this for me is, what's our country like? Who are we? What does that look like? And this morning I was sort of thinking about it. You know, 100 years ago, if you were the president, you were sensitive about, well, I need to make sure I've got somebody on my team who's from the Southwest. I need somebody who's a New York liberal. I need somebody, there was an awareness that there are different parts of the country, but they were all sort of white men back then, but you still were sensitive I've got to have somebody from the Midwest. I've got somebody who can do agriculture that has some part with the wheat people in Kansas, right? But today, the complexion and the diversity of our country is such that, you know, what does inclusion look like, or what does exclusion look like? And because of the changing demographics, I do think that this is getting played. So for me, this part of the chapter, or this part of the chapter, I think was really insightful. In short, support of Trump was strongest among white Christian men. The election was not decided by those left behind economically. Political science discovered it was designed by dominant groups anxious about their future status. Any thoughts about that? Any pushback, or that, Rosemary?
I remember being in high school back in the dark ages, and we studied sociology and civics. This was a point that was brought out in one of my classes that really struck a chord with me at that point, and I still remember it, not only here, but in a lot of situations that we see on the news, and realize that would not be politically correct to teach in a sociology class today, if there was even to be you were allowed to have a sociology class.
Yeah.
But this fact that, you know, the classes, you are, as a human being, sort of going to try to keep the people below you. And when you lose that control, that they might overtake you and put you at the bottom, it's very threatening.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just remember that. It was one class, but that was a powerful message, and it's what, you know, being said here.
Yeah. And you know, I found myself thinking about some of those great World War II movies where you've got, you know, in the foxhole, you've got the guy from Brooklyn, the Italian, and you've got, you know, it's that sense of we're blending together for something greater versus, you know, I'm here and I can't make room for anybody else. So what does this look like? Many evangelicals, the third point, and I'm toward the bottom of 267, claim to have held their noses when they voted for Trump as the lesser of two evils. But the Supreme Court was so kind of important for that.
Raymond Denny, who's a former great lawyer in this town, big Democrat, he told me, he said, John, you gotta hold your nose sometime, but you gotta vote for the party, vote for the party.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people did that as well.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and I want to be really clear that I am not unsympathetic to the notion that in the 2016 election, there were either, I mean, both candidates had issues, right? And you know, you gotta at the end of the day vote for somebody, but
Yeah, kind of the problem was, you know, the group that historically would have been Democratic put sides.
right, many of them did, yeah.
Chuck and I, it happened more in Europe in the summer of 2016. And it's when the Brexit vote was getting ready to happen. And so because we were in Europe, we heard more European and commentary than we would have typically tuned into over here. And I remember a spokesperson on the BBC talking about how this person was predicting that the vote to leave the EU was very likely to succeed because what they saw was so much anger about what they felt like, what people felt like was a potential for invasion from the other, I mean, all the things that now sound very familiar. And then we were still there when the Brexit vote was successful. And I remember thinking, this does not bode well for the 2016 election in our country. growing up. So there's so many common themes.
Right.
Fear of the other, fear of change of status, like you were saying, Rosemary, that, well, if somebody else is moving up, then I'm moving down. And economic fear is tied into that, certainly.
Right.
Because if I've lost my status, then very often that feels like I've lost any economic advantage too. So it is, as we see world around right now with the rise of authoritarianism, this is not unique to our country.
Right.
Which really, really makes me scared for the future for my precious granddaughter.
Yeah, I think that's a very important context to set this in, what's happening in other places. And the swing to the authoritarianism. We see it in Hungary, we see it in Iran,
Turkey.
Turkey, in Israel, yeah.
We saw it in First Kings.
We saw it in First Kings, is
Give us
that?
a king, give us a king.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
give us a king, the wrong king.
One thing I found interesting is, in a sentence here, but I've heard it throughout the book, is, about the evangelical nationalist Christian right, and certain character flaws may be overlooked in the interest of defending religious freedom, and they keep talking about religious freedom, but it's only their freedom, it's not universal religious freedom in our country.
Right.
So how can they even use different, well, anything, but that, I don't understand that phrase.
Right, because, I mean, my view of Christianity is the one that needs to be, on top and free. It's not this, understanding that other people may have different views and theirs are equally, needed to be, protected. That's always kind of what's lacking, in the understanding that, if you're gonna have your freedom, then somebody else who has a different opinion needs to have their freedom as well. That's where to have a contract set up. And, if in fact, but some people don't like that. And that's this notion of, what is it, moving into a theocracy? And, we saw it with the Baptist church when the narrow conservatives took over and said, basically, this is the doctrine that you have to believe. And, the way they took over all the institutions of the church was deeply problematical. But somebody said, we can take that playbook and, run it here. We, pack the court and make the laws. And, all of a sudden, what you thought were certain basic freedoms and human abilities all of a sudden get constrained because there's now a new interpretation of law. So, all right. Where are we? Has anybody read The Faith of Donald J. Trump, a spiritual biography? Wow. Pardon me? Yeah.
A thin volume.
I thought maybe you were gonna suggest that it was in the fiction.
Yeah.
Not in the biography, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I didn't know the book, but I think this is interesting. Okay, how are we gonna tie this guy? Well, English heritage, Battle of Bannockburn, and he's got that strong Viking blood through him, and
They had to go.
Scottish John Knox, and he was not a Spock baby. Parents were old school. They're parents who dared to discipline. And then this gets real interesting to me. Trump's rootedness in traditional American values, 1950s sensibilities. I think most of us could argue that the country was easier, simpler back then.
I agree.
Right.
Not for everybody.
Yeah,
There you go.
Yeah.
For a certain,
for you it was, yeah.
segment of us it was. And certainly, in the 50s, there was still more agriculture, the economics were different, all of those kind of things. The question is, can you go back to that? Can you put the genie back in that bottle?
But we don't, why would we want to go back to that? Because it was great for us. For white people, especially, can go anywhere and get anything that we want, but it wasn't that way for everyone. So I don't want to go back. I'd rather be in this troubling time where we have to figure out all this messy, ugly stuff so that we can take care of people who don't have the luxuries that we do.
Yeah.
And people often say, oh, let's just go back. It's so hard right now.
Right.
Well,
But we were so ignorant that back then.
I was talking with someone, 4th of July, and a young man who's into AI, and he says, he says, the industrialization period was difficult. Now we're going to have another change. And with AI and chat, all that stuff, he says, we're going to be changing again, and our people going to be able, and what's population or generation is going to have the hardest time changing, and all of that. He said, that's going to be our next hurdle, yeah.
I will be one of those for whom it will be a challenge. So technologically, look at Luddite in the dictionary in my pictures there.
And you're good with that, right?
But, I mean, I understand a certain level of pull and tug over the nostalgia. I wasn't around in the 50s, but, the neighborhood I grew up in, you left your doors unlocked, ran to the playground and played all day, and, life was pretty uncomplicated that way. But I do think, it's much more complicated today, and we can't go back. So the question is, how do we go forward in a way that lifts the boat for us all and preserves the democracy? I mean, that's to me, the real challenge. You can't go back. And so how do you move forward? And,
but like it says on 271, it was black and white, and like several people have talked in the past, black and white is easier. And he made it all black and white.
I was thinking, and I might have the timeline wrong, because I don't watch television, or certainly didn't during a part of my life, but the juxtaposition of when we were growing up in the 50s and early 60s, many of us, with Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver and all of those kinds of shows, and then a reflection later of Mad Men. Isn't that the same period? And yet our perception growing up in real time was Father Knows Best.
Right.
And the reflection backward is Mad Men. So was it all rosy? Well, again, not for everyone.
right.
There's a wonderful opera, little known, by Leonard Bernstein called Trouble in Tahiti. And it's the Mad Men side. It's fantastic. It's real short. Very.
There's such a thing as a short opera?
This one is, yeah. Well, it's Bernstein, so it's not. I mean,
Like 3 bars.
It's not fairly, it's Bernstein.
Emily?
I was just, your thoughts about perception, I think are spot on, and I think one thing is, because we have sort of information overload right now, and through technology and all that, like our perception of things is very different. And, so when you ask people about crime and you ask people about things like that, they think that now is the most dangerous time. When violent crime peaked in the 90s, they think kidnappings are up, those peaked in the 70s. Like, things are very different. I had dinner with a new neighbor recently who moved to Nashville to get away from crime in San Francisco. Despite the fact that violent crime is higher in Nashville than in San Francisco. But there's this perception that, California's got great laws and everyone can just do crime. And so it's like, how does our perception versus how does our reality affect our choices and how we exist in the world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One of the things I always used to say to the kids, and I was always conscious of it, when they were young, most mornings I was driving them either to Grassland Elementary, Grassland Middle, or Brentwood High, and we would, if you know the geography, we lived at Horseshoe Bend on Vaughn, and come out of the neighborhood, and I would take a right and dead end into Sneed, and then take a left and Hillsborough to Murray Lane, and then over to the schools. And we come down Vaughn to the T and that beautiful farm that's right along there. And I would say to the kids, more mornings than they wanted to hear, bring in this beautiful site. Because this is beginning to influence your interior world of what life is like. That so much of our perception is, you know, we're driving somewhere and I'd say to the kids, what would your life be like if you lived there? If that was your home and that was your experience? You know, we're so shaped, I think, by that internal view of what the world looks like. And for so many of us, you know, we didn't grow up in an inner city high rise, right? I know that God would never call me to a church in Florida because I have to have some green space and trees and little hill or a mountain around. You come to my house and, you know, we had a big party in my house sometime, and I've got I collect landscape paintings, and a whole bunch of them are green hills with a barn in it. You know, that I used to ride horses 3 times a week, and you know, this beautiful farmland. And I just think, golly, if that's the only vision of my world, that's limited. You know, I think of some of my very influential members of my church in Dalton, Georgia. Their view of the world was shaped by Northwest Georgia. And, you know, didn't want anything coming in from the outside that was different. I lost my musician, and we had a committee up to choose a new one, and I had a buddy of mine come in and interview to sort of set a bar of the kind of people we want to look at. And the chair of the committee, wonderful man who was the administrator of the Hamilton Hospital, which was a great little hospital in Dalton that punched above its weight, in part because this guy was the president of the National Hospital Administrators for the whole country, right? You know, this is not as small. He was a big, and he's begging me, please let us hire this guy. And my friend, Paul McKenzie, and his partner at the time was a man named Lance. And I said, you know, I can't bring my friend in here because of the pushback of what it means to have a out gay person in Northwest Georgia in my country. I couldn't do it. And I said to my friend Paul, if I was ever ahead of staff and I needed somebody, I would pick up the phone and I'd call you. But I mean, that would have been awful. In that context, for my friend, what he would have had to put up. And being there was one of the first places I had to deal with big city versus small town. And, you know, limited, and we don't want that stuff coming in from the outside, kind of a deal. And so we hired somebody who, you know, was not as good as Paul. Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the whole Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best versus Mad Men perception too, is this was small town, Mad Men was big city. You know?
Yeah. Well, the other really interesting thing about Mad Men, and I've not done a kind of a deep dive into it, but sort of the three main male characters, the guy with the silver hair, who was the principal of the firm, Don, who was, and then a guy who was a little bit younger, were sort of showing three generations of men. The silver-haired guy was the World War II, Don was Korea, and this other guy was kind of post-Korea moving into Vietnam. And the way those kind of things got worked out, I think were really interesting. Yeah. Well, listen, we've got a little extra time, but anything else for the good of the whole out of the chapter? So we're going to take next week off. We'll be back on the 31st to finish up. Grateful that you all are hanging in here with me. I think this is a really very important book that we're looking at.
One thing that, when I was listening to it and, that came to me was, you know, how the evangelicals overlooked everything that, you know, that I would say normal people would not overlook, but anyway, and now with all this stuff, you know, all these indictments and everything, is it still gonna be, well, who cares, you know?
Yeah.
That's the thing that troubles me the most about it.
Right.
That there's just no sense that he can do any wrong. I don't get it.
Yeah, and I think it would be an interesting conversation to have, or, you know, what are peccadillos and what are actually crimes, for instance, you know, and how that gets factored through all of this, you know, in my reading of it, you know, what these indictments are clearly worse than what Nixon faced with, you know, the Watergate situation. And, you know, are we gonna have the political will to hold accountability for high crimes, if they're proved? And I think that's gonna be a really telling mark about the strength of our democracy, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, even Nixon was smart enough to step down.
Yeah, he was smart
I
enough,
can't
but,
imagine Trump ever stepping down.
but part of what precipitated that as well is a goodly number of leadership in his own party
Yeah.
said, you have lost the ability to lead.
Yes, yeah.
And what will happen to the country if we actually have to remove you?
Right.
What that's gonna do to our party, you know, is crazy. And then, of course,
Now we're seeing.
you have a couple of interesting things happen. When LBJ signs the Voter Right Act, he says, we've lost the Democratic Party in the South for, you know, a couple generations. When Jerry Ford pardoned Nixon, he was pretty clear that I've lost the Republican Party for a while. And yet, you know, it works if we are not in zero-sum game opposition to one another. But if the parties are working really to find a greater good for us all. And right now that system seems to be in jeopardy and broken. And, you know, there are too few people who are willing to say what we need to find is somewhere here in the center as we move forward together, it seems to me.
Amen.
Yeah.
The problem is, Trump's supporters either don't care or don't believe that even if these things are true, you know, they don't care, you know, he gets more support, the more they indict him, the more support he gets.
Right. Well, and it is problematic to think of what percentage of, you know, people still don't believe that the sitting president was duly elected.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
Yeah. Although this morning I watched a little bit of news, which I haven't in so long. And there was a poll out this morning that said 50%, now I don't know who did it,
of people believe that he should not run.
Right.
As of this morning,
Yeah.
so.
And again, I want to be really clear, we could go, we could run down more rabbit, than we have time for. But I think what I've appreciated about this book is the narrow focus of the evangelical, church becoming white nationalist church.
Right.
And the movement of that into the political realm and what that has spawned, I think is something that we need to really look at as Christians, right? That's why I chose this book and why I want us to look at it. And Stephanie, I appreciated your comments earlier about, that causes us all to look in the mirror about, what our choices are. But if we are serious about what does it mean to be Christians in the American experience of democracy, how does this get worked out? And, who are the winners and who are the losers and.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, we've beaten on Trump and, Biden's name never comes up.
Who's that?
But,
Right, Biden's name never comes up.
what never comes up?
Biden's name.
Oh,
It'll be interesting to see if it comes up in the next chapter.
Yeah, and it is a timing thing, sure.
It is a timing thing.
Yeah.
And, there are some issues there. I'm gonna step out of my normal role and just say, personally, I think one of the most refreshing things about these last couple of years is that the president has not dominated the news cycle every moment. That, things are happening, with the government and, I think what's happened with NATO and, facing this threat, that we've had in Russia and Ukraine, to reestablishing NATO when it was so profoundly damaged. And our diplomatic, stuff is.
Well, and Biden is meeting at Camp David, I think maybe this weekend or soon, with the head of South Korea and Japan.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Also, the copyright of this, John, is 2020, which means it was written well before that.
I said
So,
timing,
in terms of Biden.
Yeah.
certainly.
And also watching out, we don't ourselves fall into the us and them,
Right,
because us and them isn't gonna do us any good at all.
right.
Because we live next door to them and sometimes I'm them, Seriously, people made the decision that they made and are making the decisions that they make based on a lot of things. And being the best that we can be around everybody and honoring who they are is really important. And I know that that can be hard in some extreme circumstances, but not all circumstances are super extreme.
Yeah.
So we gotta keep that in mind.
Yes.
The Lord be with you. God of grace and mercy, thank you for this day and for a chance to rest and study together. We are grateful for the founding fathers and mothers who put together this experiment in democracy and set some boundaries between church and states. We ask for deep wisdom as your believers as we seek to build up our country. We pray for all in leadership. I think of our own members here, Eli Richardson, our federal judge. Thank you for Glenn Funk, our district attorney. Thank you for those who have served and are willing to put their names in to serve for our common good. Give us wisdom to see beyond the narrow, that we might look for ways to build a community and a country that is beneficial for all. Give us a willingness to break down barriers between those whom we disagree with. We pray, oh God, that all that we do might give you glory. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody.
And God, thank you for God.
Yeah.
Amen. Well said.